And now onto Home Sweet Hoenn, with abilities, a more vibrant color palette, and the trumpets. Oh yes, the trumpets! I am aware that between the two separate games of Ruby and Sapphire, Team Aqua and Team Magma are different battles that you do have. However, because their Pokemon are largely similar, they have common Pokemon that are actually used very frequently between the two of them, we're going to be looking at them in a very similar capacity. As well as the fact that the gyms, the rivals, Elite Four, and just everything else does not change between that. The only difference is that, okay, 6 battles have a different ace Pokemon. We're not really going to be considering that as heavily. Their games are pretty much identical outside of that, so we're not going to be weighing heavily on this. Let's continue. It's time to rock and roll with our first gym. At the very least, for once, the first gym leader has a Pokemon with decent stats and actual stab coverage. For once, I know it's a shocker. Defensive, pretty well. Nose Pass is actually extremely good as a solid defensive Pokemon early on. It isn't the strongest thing in the world. It's not going to be doing out a super lot of damage, but it is extremely bulky, especially for this point. And the fact that it does have Rock Tomb, which is a decently good move, it actually is more powerful in base power than most moves available at this point. It can put up a fight. It definitely can put up a fight. Also, I would like to remind you that because we are doing the same level as the opposing trainers, Torchic will not have evolved by this point, so everything is still base form starters, so Combusken does not have access yet. Another thing to also remember is, unlike Generation 2, this game only has a badge boost insofar as it is a stat increase of 10%. It does not have the type boost. So that's again another thing to consider now that we have our first badge down. Bulking up, Brawly is our second gym leader to take down, and he's not the worst. Setup is not a terrible idea theoretically, but as every single starter is actually a special attacker by pure typing because of the way the types work, this doesn't work as well when you're only boosting your physical defense, not your special defense, and this is not something that they can actually deal with particularly well. They can actually deal out a lot of damage if they do get bulk up set up decently well. They can definitely hurt, but at the same time, they're going to be taking special damage if, again, using a special attacker, which every starter is. But if only physical attackers are what you are using, or that all you have available, it actually is not a terribly easy fight for you because, again, they are boosting their physical defense, and they're also boosting their physical offense. Though this is somewhat counterbalanced by actually in Hoenn specifically, a lot of Pokemon early on do actually get special attacks. This is something that a lot of the other games actually don't have. It's actually the opposite in many other games, where predominantly everything early on is physical aside from the starters. There are a decent number of special type attackers, or at least Pokemon using special attacks, that have stabs on those from a very early level. It's actually very an unusual thing, and it's one of the big things that kind of makes Brawly's setup as not as solid as it would be in, say, a different generation. Cranking the voltage up, we got Watson. And no, Magneton is really his only powerhouse. Magnemite can be a problem if it does manage to get a paralysis off, but it does have a strong special attack, but it is quite frail, and really it's only relying on Sonic Boom for damage. Voltorb is bad. It's fast, yes, and it will outspeed almost everything available at this point, but it really only has rollout to Snowball, and with its frailty, this really doesn't go well. If somehow he manages to build it up, it definitely will hit hard, but really Magneton is his only Pokemon of notable threat potential. Flannery is actually where things get a little interesting. Sunny Day setup on Slugma. One of them having Overheat, the other having Flamethrower, Light Screen. They have very solid tech, and her Torkoal having access to Flail and Body Slam, this thing can actually stand up to water types pretty well, at least for the point in the game you're at, because of how stats are at this point. Torkoal does actually have a very fantastic stat spread, and especially considering things are not going to be fully evolved by this point, it can actually hold its own very well. Really, only rock types can have an easy time against this thing, and even then they don't have really the best special defense, and overheat from it will still do a lot, especially if it's sun boosted. Dad's given us a lesson back at Norman's gym in Petalburg. And yeah, your eyes are not deceiving you. Those are indeed too slacking. Even with Truant, at this point in the game, these things will heavily outstat everything available. They are utter monsters physically, offensively, and on both fronts defensively. Plus, they also have very high speed, so you're not outrunning these things. Remember, this is a thing that has stats on par with box art legendaries. This thing is no joke. It also has Yawn for attack. It has a 160 base attack stat, which is actually its true attack stat, higher than even Groudon's physical attack stat later in the game. It also has Stab Facade, so it has Sleep to get around its Truant ability, and extremely solid power moves. Anything that doesn't resist this thing, you're probably going to get obliterated. And even then, resists are probably not going to hold out that well, all things considered, if you get slept by this thing. Unless you have something like Dig or Protect to go around its Truant turns. And this thing can definitely handle a long, drawn-out slugfest, which is what it's going to turn into. Vigoroth, only having Slash and Encore is not as great, but it's still a decent techie damage combo. His final Slacking has Slash and Encore as well. He has very good ways of mitigating the negative ability that Slacking has, and really maximizing its potential for this point in the game. These things are utter monsters, and they are not to be underestimated unless you have a way to dodge the Truant not being affected turns. That's all you can really do, is just try to dodge the turns. Flying high with the Winona, we head over to her with her illegal Altaria. Yep. It doesn't learn Dragon Dance this early. She does have an illegal Altaria. Together, Altaria and Skarmory can pretty much wreck anything. You have two very defensive Pokemon for this point in the game, with two incredibly good type combinations, especially for this point in the game. One which has Dragon Dance and Earthquake. For Swallow having Double Team and Endeavor is actually not terrible. Yes, it is quite frail, but if it does manage to get off enough Double Teams, which, because it is fast, it can get off a Double Team, generally stack up two of them, has a chance of evading, and then just go for Endeavor attacks, and then finishing off with Quick Attack, isn't terrible. Because remember, Endeavor will drop your HP to whatever its health is as well. So, even if it doesn't have the best HP, it can use its low defenses to its advantage by dropping your health to get around your defenses. It's not a bad strategy, actually. It's something that actually does sometimes see competitive usage. Well, not the evasion part, but just the Endeavor usage. We have the tag-teaming twins, Tate and Liza, who's ready to melt your mind with their psychic-type combinations. And it's the first Double Battle Gym Leader, the first of two in the entire series. Excluding, of course, the remakes and Emerald. This is a fight that really dips things back from difficult into easy. Having Light Screen and Hypnosis, this is actually a bit of an interesting combination. If it manages to land a Sleep, it can actually take a bit of an advantage. Even though it doesn't have exactly the most stellar stats, a Sleep in a double battle can actually be a huge tide turner, because at that point, it's a 2 versus 1. With Hypnosis, Calm Mind, and Light Screen, it doesn't exactly pair up super well with only having Reliance. Like, again, if it gets a Sleep, it can be a little bit dangerous, but that is just the case if it does get Sleep. Solrock is the more offensive of the two, having Sunny Day, Flamethrower, Reflect, and Plague as well. It's not terrible, but unless it can get that Sunset up and it can use Solar Beam, it really just... They just have so many weaknesses. In fact, Psychic Rock is actually the type combination tied for the most number of weaknesses in the entire series. It's actually tied at 7 weaknesses for the most number of weaknesses of a single typing combination in the series. And even with Levitate, it can only dodge one of those, so it still has 6 other weaknesses, which is around a third of all remaining types. And with their not the best stats, these two don't really have much going for them. They're not especially fast, so they can't go fast, set up screens, have a little bit of extra bulk, and do that to take care of things. They're going to get outsped, and they're going to take some damage beforehand. They aren't terrible, and double battles are not something most teams can be equipped for, but even this team isn't really equipped for double battles. Double battles can't be won by just 2 Pokemon, and again, they only have 2 Pokemon, which really kneecaps this team. And with Wallace, there is no contest here, as he is the final gym leader. The water is rising, or is it? I mean, we're talking about a guy who is seriously using a love disc on a gym leader team. A love disc. And only his Whiscash has a move over 65 base power. That is also stab. Even his Celio is not fully evolved by this point. Milotic does have Ice Beam, but it isn't exactly stab. It can indeed put up a bit of a fight against things, and indeed actually do some damage to grass types, but on its own, it really doesn't do much. This is exactly what I meant by quality over quantity. He may have 5 Pokemon, he may have a very great Pokemon in Milotic, but the other 4 are just simply poor. Quality over quantity wins every time, and quantity over quality rarely ever wins. Especially as 2 of them are basically cannon fodder, and a third to a degree in Celio, which isn't exactly the most threatening in the world. Not exactly the most challenging thing for a final gym battle, but it's not terrible. It could be a lot worse, but also could be a lot better. They really don't have good moves. The rival battles of May or Brendan, depending on which player character you pick, are pretty much stay on the same course as other previous rivals, where they have a half-baked grass, fire, water trio core. But even in their final battle, which is optional actually, which is actually an optional battle, it's not required, their teams are just not imposing at all. Their teams are all packed with Pokemon of relatively poor stats, especially by this point, and they really just don't put up much of a fight. We're just going to actually flash through them all right here really quick, but these teams don't really stack up much. The first fight with Wally is not even worth a mention. He just has a Ralts, and yeah. So we'll be skipping right to the final fight, because yes, you only have 1 fight with him outside of that, and his team is indeed all over the place. Altaria's, it's decent-ish, kind of. Delcatty is interesting. It can be a bit irritating, but really, it doesn't have much of a threat because it's slow, it's not very bulky, and it really doesn't have great offensive stats, so it can't really threaten much. Even if he has a good move off of Assist, it really can't threaten all that much. But again, Sing, something being put to sleep, can be a bit annoying, but that's really all it can do. Potentially Fish for Sing, but that's all it got. That's all it's got. Roselia is weak. It's weak. Magneton, it can be a strong Pokemon, even actually at this point. It hasn't completely fallen off. It's not terrible, but it still isn't exactly great. But Gardevoir is really what his powerhouse of the team is. It is a force. Double Team, Calm Mind, decent special defense, okay special attack. If it gets an evasion off, and it can just stack up Calm Minds, this thing's a hard-hitting monster. Even if it does only have Psychic, this thing actually can do a lot of damage. Again, because if it stacks up those Calm Minds, it will do damage. With the rivals out of the way, we can move on to the admins. Matt and Tabitha first up for the Magma and Aqua team. First fought at Mount Chimney. Tabitha is the harder at the very least, since Numel at least has the very strong Magnitude, which is at least a very decent move. Not like the strongest thing in the world that can fluctuate in terms of power, but it is actually a pretty decent move. But both of their teams are not especially, sturdy, only having 2 Pokemon each. They're not exactly great. Even if Numel does have a decent move, it's decent. It doesn't actually have great stats. Much like the admin fight, Maxie is actually the stronger of both him and Archie, possessing a better team, but that really doesn't say a whole lot given these two teams' compositions. Only having Sharpedo over Camerupt, Sharpedo does have a very strong crunch, which does at least put out a little bit of a threat potential, especially by this point. Up next is the Weather Institute having actually the same deal all over again. As Shelly and Courtney, 3 for 3 when it comes to teams of poor composition when storming the HQ. Their moves have pretty much not changed, and their teams have not either, save for one evolution. Sharpedo's crunch might hurt, but by this point, the stats have been rather tamed by levels and evolutions having taken place, and Camerupt really isn't putting up as much of a fight as it used to. I feel like we're just talking in circles at this point. I mean, Shelly, I love you, but really, Sharpedo is not carrying that much anymore. It's really not great. It's like, why are they called Team Aqua and they don't even have any water moves? It makes no sense. Why? At least you can forgive Team Magma because Lava Plume didn't exist until the next generation. So, like, really? You get a pass, Courtney. At least for now. At least for now. And, of course, once again, Team Magma does have the better moveset. However, when fighting in the Seabed Cavern, they suffer the same fate. Bad moves, Archie's moves are garbage, and Maxie's team is 66% the same, just with a moderately better Pokemon in Camerupt as his ace, but again, that really doesn't say a whole lot. We are 5 for 5 here, people. Could you villains put up a fight, please? Hopefully the Elite Four can pull ahead. Maybe. Can they be decent, or will they not be? Let's find out right now with Sydney. Actually, they are. At least, aside from Sydney. His team is not exactly stellar. Dark types really haven't come into their own in this generation, so he's pretty much using all glass cannons. And not particularly good ones. They're all fairly slow. They don't really have the greatest of offensive stats either. And being glass cannons, they're paper thin. At the very least, he does have some decent coverage and neat tech. Yeah, Absol and Sharpedo are his two hardest hitting things, but that really isn't saying a whole lot, as aside from Sharpedo having actually quite high speed, its attack power is moderate at best, and Absol is still comparatively slow and frail, even though it does have a better attacking stat. However, Phoebe is actually where things do pick up, and that is because she is packing the quite powerful Dusclops. Not powerful in the sense that it will do a lot of damage in one turn type power, but rather in its titanic bulk. It might have not great HP, but it does have extremely high defenses. Especially considering by this point, Dark and Ghost types have their effectiveness flipped on most Pokemon using those moves. This thing can actually take neutral hits pretty well, and non-stab super effective coverage moves also don't really chip it down that hard. Physical Shadow Balls actually do help Banette, one of the few Pokemon that actually does benefit from Shadow Ball being physical, unlike what we just said prior. It actually is quite okay. It's not the bulkiest thing, it is quite frail and not really that fast, but it can hit okay. And one of them actually does have Will-O-Wisp, which if it lands that can be detrimental to any physical attacker and also just get residual rack up over time. However, the second also having Toxic, so both have actually excellent residual damage tactics. Both of these actually do pair exceptionally well with the fact that she does have 2 Dusclops, because again, the titanic bulk, they're pretty good at wearing stuff down. Sableye is the not great one. Not having a weakness doesn't really say a whole lot. That's one of the things a lot of people seem to forget about Sableye, is he doesn't really have great defenses. It took until Generation 6 with Mega Sableye to really make this type combination work especially well, because even the better Spirit Tube next generation wasn't that great. No weakness isn't terrible, it's just you also need the right defensive stats to back it up. And Sableye doesn't have the defense, doesn't have the offense to really make either of them work. But it's time to chill out with Galacia. Continuing Phoebe's doubling up of 2 evolutionary lines, we see she is doing the same with Glalie and Celio. Well, actually tripling up, I guess, because she has a Walrein in 3rd. The first of her two Glalie having Crunch, Ice Beam, Light Screen, and a Hail. The second having a Hail, Shadow Ball, Ice Beam, and Crunch. Not great. Not particularly great. They can potentially set up screens, potentially set up Hail, but really that's it. They don't really do a whole lot of damage. They're not especially bulky. They're not fast. 80 across the board is not exactly great. Her two Celio, the first one having Surf, Ice Ball, Hail, and Body Slam. The second having Hail, Blizzard, Dive, and Attract. They're not bad. They can actually do a bit of exploiting of Hail's rack up damage, and through the use of status or even the neutrally powered Blizzard. Through the use of potential paralysis on Body Slam and also the strong stab move of Surf, even though it is not fully evolved, it doesn't have exactly the greatest offensive stats, it is at least decently bulky, and the rack up from Hail is actually quite good, as well as the potential snowballing effect of Ice Ball, or perfectly accurate Blizzards are not really anything to joke at, even if you do have stab, even on not a great attacking stat. They're not terrible. They actually can do some decent damage, even if it's over a bit of a prolonged period of time. The big one is her Wall Rain. This thing also has Blizzard, so if the allies have set up Hail, it can capitalize, and capitalize well. Having both Surf and Body Slam, it's a bit of a combination of the prior two Celio, topped all off with sheer hold. Yeah, this thing's a bit of a threat. It's definitely a bit of a threat. And again, with its enormous bulk, it actually can use that Citrus Berry extremely well, considering it has great defenses and actually pretty high HP. It's not exactly a pushover. Roaring loud and proud, we've got Drake, the last of the Hoenn Elite Four. Altaria is a bit subpar compared to the Pokemon we've seen a bit prior, but still, a Dragon Dance or two, it's a bit of a force. It is a bit of a force with Dragon Dance. Flygon is pretty fast, not the greatest special attack, but it at least can do some damage because it is quite fast and at least doesn't have terrible defenses. Sadly, it does not have Earthquake, but it does have Flamethrower to hit Steel types, and also Ice types. However, his second one is actually packing Dig and Fly to make better use of its physical attacking stats, on top of taking advantage of its actually much stronger physical attack stat with Stab. Even though Dig and Fly are two-turn moves, they are a bit problematic, but it's still stronger moves. Shelgon is a bit of an interesting case. Physically, it actually is extraordinarily bulky. And that's what this thing's meant for. It's not meant for damage, it's meant for tech. Fishing for paralysis with its actually quite solid bulk and also having the ability to drop speed with Rock Tomb, this thing is meant not to be an actual damage dealer, but rather to disrupt your team to make a hole for his next Pokemon and his final, the mighty Salamance. This thing has excellent stats across the board. It has Intimidate. It also has a pretty good coverage moveset. This thing is an all-around powerhouse, and if a rock type comes in unsuspecting, it can get Intimidate dropped if it's in the initial send-out. There's a reason Salamence is one of the few, if the only Pokemon to ever make a mixed attacking set fundamentally usable at a high level. It's a beast, and an excellent one at that. While yes, his entire team is massively weak to Ice, he at least has some ways of counteracting that. Even if they're not the best, he at least does have some things to not make him toothless. Plus, everything on his team, barring Shelgon, actually does have an immunity. Interesting thing about Dig, if Flygon uses Dig, it actually will still be immune to Earthquake due to Levitate. So, he has a pretty good way of actually hiding from damage. He actually does have a bit of good resistances all around. However, all these teams pale before the champion himself, Steven Stone. Unlike every other champion, both before and prior, his team focuses on one thing above all: defensive potential to back up heightened power. Bulky offense is the name of the game, and his team actually does it very well. Pretty much everything across the board has, at the very least, modest defenses across the board. The only one having a weak point in this is actually the low special defense on his Aggron, but it more than makes up for it with its excellent physical defense. Having actually pretty good stall tactics on his Skarmory with a combination of spikes and toxic, paired up with its actually pretty decent bulk, it can pretty much ensure at least one layer of spikes and a toxic or 2 layers of spikes can actually go out, which actually works very well to supplement its weak offenses. And also they are indeed big threats throughout the entire course of the battle. Doubling down on this is his Claydol, having very good defenses across the board. It also is actually oddly quite fast for what you would think, and it does pack in dual screens, further augmenting its already impressive bulk. Ancient Power and Earthquake are not really the most threatening of things from it, considering its less than stellar offenses, but this thing isn't really meant to do damage. It's meant to set up screens and slowly wear away in a war of attrition, which it does do quite well. Aggron, again, is the weakest link in his team, but a nice little cute note is that because it has Solar Beam and Thunder, it actually has a move that will perfectly always hit either of the 2 weather legendaries. Even if it's coming off its poor special attack, it's still a nice little thing, even if it isn't great. It only has one move that is actually using its physical attack, which is it. However, it also doesn't have a stab move, having Earthquake instead. It's the weak one, it is the weakest link in his team, but every team's gotta have one. After that, there is Dilli and Armaldo, 2 Pokemon with very obnoxious type combinations. Particularly Dilli having a very obnoxious type combination and actually quite solid defenses, it can fish for confusions and poisons decently well. In fact, the only thing that can actually face it easily is a Steel type. I would also like to keep in mind, Steel moves at the time of Generation 3 were kind of bad. Really the best thing that there was Iron Tail or Metal Claw. And against something with this kind of bulk, not really doing too much. And lastly, to round out his team is the Fearsome Metagross. Faster than you'd expect, bulky on both ends, this thing is a nigh unkillable monster, especially if the screens from Claydol are up when this thing comes out. Earthquake for fire types. Psychic target the weaker special defense of ground types that they generally have. And even just a Meteor Mash for strong neutral damage. This thing really doesn't need Hyper Beam aside from, like, water types. Topped with all of that, you cannot drop this thing's stats because of Clear Body. The only way to drop this thing's stats are things such as Burn or Paralysis. At a glance, Water might actually stack up well against his team, but remember, Dilli is indeed still a member of his team, and Metagross can at least take a good hit or 2 from water types because of its Citrus Berry and its excellent bulk across the board, and still hammer them pretty hard. This is very much an imposing team. This thing is most definitely a step up from Johto. The funny thing is about Hoenn is that it actually has possibly the most wide swing of difficulty experienced by players depending on which starter you pick, which is something actually we will get into a little bit later. The game does indeed have its hard fights. Yes, Team Aqua and especially, yes, Team Magma and especially Team Aqua are pretty much jokes, all things considered. The hard fights are in a lot of other areas. The villainous teams and also the rivals have kind of always been pushovers, all things considered. Where the fights really get real are the gym leaders and the Elite Fours. This is where the step up really happens. I'm looking at you, Dad. Even in just the Elite Four, 3 of them have at least... Even just looking at the Elite Four and Champion, at the very least, 3 of them have pretty decent teams, and even the other 2 have at least some neat things going for them that can really help them. And especially Steven, who has a team that is focused not just on brute force power, but bulky offense, which is something that you actually see in competitive that is a very good strategy. You know, winning a battle is as much about defensive advantage as it is about offensive advantage, and he can pretty much secure both of those. The other part of this is also that more trainers just consistently have better moves rather than the pathetically weak ones. That's one of the biggest changes. Outside of just general team compositions, stats have gotten better by this point. Things have stats that are much more beneficial, and moves are finally of respectable power. We're seeing gym leaders that have stab moves over 70, 80 base power in some cases. Yes, some of them do fall off, but we're also seeing setup moves, things that were not in the previous ones in the same capacity. This is really where you can see that Pokemon were made more intelligently, with actual stats being placed in beneficial places, rather than just kind of being slapped together like they used to be. It definitely makes the game a lot harder, even while you yourself have better Pokemon. The AI's teams have been increasing at a better rate than the AI teams of the previous games. Up next, we're actually going to be looking at Fire Red and Leaf Green. This is because Emerald actually came out after them. So, let's see how Special Defense and the addition of abilities treat Kanto, as well as the addition of the Dark and Steel typings, which you actually can't access because this game is stupid. We're actually going over to Fire Red and Leaf Green next, as Emerald did actually release later, so we'll be looking at that after this, because again, difficulty is progression of the series. So, onto Fire Red, Leaf Green, and Kanto. Let's see how the introduction of Steel, offensively Dark typing, Special Defense, and abilities treat this game. Let's find out. With Brock, everything is pretty much the same as last time. I'm not going to really bear going over it again because we've already actually gone over this, but at least his Onix does now actually have a rock move. Up next, Misty. Her Staryu and her Starmie actually have a decent water move, and Starmie actually having Recover is actually quite good. While they did lose some special defense, Water Pulse isn't terrible. Lieutenant Surge has actually seen a little bit of a charge now that he has Shockwave. It does hit a little harder than the previous moves he had. Thunderwave and Double Team can get a couple of cheap shots he couldn't have gotten otherwise, so it's not terrible. Doesn't really have much bulk on his team, but it's a little bit of decent tech. Erica's team with Vileplume and Victory Bell, and her entire team having as much status as it does, even though Giga Drain is not especially powerful, they do have solid stats by this point, and again, with all of that status tech, they can do a good amount of work. Even if it's not upfront damage, they have pretty decent stats. I mean, Victory Bell does at least have, like, somewhat decent offensive stats, and Vileplume can take a couple hits pretty well. Koga leaning very much into that Toxic Stall strategy. With Smokescreen and Acid Armor, it can actually be a bit of a problem shoring up the lower defense, and of course, as usual, dropping accuracy. He can stall hits a little well, and as Toxic Poison does do damage much more readily than regular poison, it really can stack up. 2 or 3 turns go by, and a solid chunk of HP is gone. Really, only Magnemite and Magneton can have an easy time against this thing, because even though poison types cannot be poisoned themselves, a lot of poison types don't really have as strong of a move as Sludge Bomb, and poisons are dealing themselves neutral damage and poisons themselves are dealing resisted damage against his team. So, War of Attrition, he's definitely gotten better at doing so. Sabrina is easier than last time. It's funny, the trainers that were used to be easier have now gotten a little harder, and Sabrina's now much easier. This is for 2 reasons. 1, special defense is now separate from special attack, so your team can't really hide behind its massive special bulk with its massive special offense anymore. It's one or the other. The second is, now that Bite does exist as a dark type move, they have a weakness beyond They have a weakness beyond Bug, and also Ghost has been fixed. However, that and also Ghost has indeed been fixed, so they can be indeed hit by Ghost type moves that are super effective. So, she's really gotten a lot easier just because of type effectiveness having changed, and also because, again, special defense has been introduced. They take more damage from just general special moves. For Alakazam, it does have Calm Mind that can be a bit scary, especially if it can set up those moves, because it does actually have quite good stats, even if it doesn't have exactly stellar defense. It might be able to survive a Bite from most things, because nothing does have same type attack bonus, and Bite is quite weak. But really, outside of that, she doesn't really have much else. Blaine has indeed turned up the heat. Growlithe and Arcanine, both having Intimidate, are solid abilities. Yes, Rapidash and Ponyta are not especially great, but having Fire Blast at least does pack quite a punch, even if Fire Spin is pretty pathetic. Bounce is not really that great. It could threaten a potential paralysis, but it also really isn't exactly that strong because Rapidash doesn't have the greatest of offensive stats, nor does it have the greatest of bulk. At least Giovanni himself has also gotten significantly stronger. Now actually possessing same type attack bonus on multiple members of his team, much like he did in Yellow, he's a little better. Fighting moves, even though they're not especially great on the Nidos because of their low attack stats and all, because of their not great attacking power of those moves, it's at least an effort. It deals with some of the resistances that things have to poison, so it's not great, but it's at least a pretty decent strategy. At least a pretty decent moveset combination. On to Rival Blue. Onwards to Blue, much of it actually held true of the previous games actually still holds here, as we're seeing right below. Even for the point in the game they're at, these teams are not especially great. Even Cadabra, which as we've mentioned before with Alakazam, because the change to Special and also the much more wider distribution of the move Bite, it's really been tamed and is just not even as strong as it used to be, so it really got knocked down a peg. Even until you get to the battle at Silph Co, Alakazam only has Future Sight. Even then, Gyarados is possibly a bit of a threat with Dragon Rage, as we've been over a bit with base HP stats. 40 damage at this late in the game really just doesn't matter all that much, and everything else it has is special, which, given its stats, as we've been over before, aren't exactly great. Only his team with Charizard is actually sort of good, and that's just because Charizard at least has decent moves, but Growlithe and Execute are not even fully evolved, and they also have just weak moves on top of that. His Venusaur it's really only able to threaten with status first. This holds through onto Route 22, where only Alakazam has gotten better, Gyarados has actually gotten worse, and Rhyhorn joining the Growlithe and Execute as not fully evolved and weak move holders. Once again, his Charizard is the only starter that actually has decent moves. Now over to Giovanni as the Team Rocket battles. What a shocker, both of his teams are complete garbage. At least they have stabs, but they're decent at best, and Nidoqueen at least does have Double Kick, as we've been over. It actually is a fairly decent move combination, so it's not complete garbage, but it's still not great. In post-game, there is Gideon, where he is basically the Team Rocket boss of post-game, but at the point in the game they're at, his team is just terrible. Not fully evolved Pokemon for several of his team members. They just don't stand up well. There actually are two sort of admins here, as well as in post-game. They are teams that are based on the late-game executives from the Johto games, and their teams are I mean, you can look for yourself, but they're just not great. They're not great. Elite Four time! Starting off with, of course, Lorelei, as is the general fare for all Kanto games, because it's always the same Elite Four. And she does have pretty decent moves with some good tech all around. However, this is the one caveat to this. The special defense split was not very kind to her. A lot of her Pokemon did actually have pretty good special stats back then. Now, their special defense is not as high as their special attack, or vice versa, so they don't possess as much threat potential as before, as well as, again, Blizzard actually has gotten a little weaker in terms of accuracy, but she's Bruno finally learned to give his Hitmonchan a physical move. It only took, what, 2 track-throughs in previous games and a remake? His team all around actually does have some improvement, well, aside from Onix. It does have at least a little bit of decent bulk, and it can hit flying types at least. His team all around does actually have a bit more reliable moves, so it is a little better in that respect. It actually is a bit... I wouldn't call it a force, but it at least has decent moves. Agatha is where things just all go wrong. The special split wasn't especially kind to Lorelei. It was far worse for her. You know, at least her team can still sort of manage, but Agatha just can't. It stripped almost all the strength out of her team. Having primarily physical moves on special attackers, that is a very poor sign when the biggest fear of her team is a Sludge Bomb from Arbok. Or KOing her so fast enough you don't need to worry about Golbat landing a Poison Fang badly poisoned. Lance is not great. He's got decent Pokemon with decent moves, but that's all they are, decent at best. Gyarados, we've been over. Aerodactyl is strong enough, I guess, but not especially. Though at the very least, his two Outrage Dragonair aren't 100% toothless in all of this. However, his Dragonite is its normal, all-around, pretty good self. It doesn't have the sheer type coverage previous teams did, but it does actually have at least a little more reliability in stab wing attack, so it's not horrible. It's not horrible, but it's not great. As a champion, he's just not great. Even as a champion, he's just not great. Gyarados is falling off even worse than it did before. As we've mentioned before with the Dragon Rage, it's even worse now that levels have grown. Rock Tomb is, it's not terrible, but it's worse than Rock Blast. At the very least, is Rhydon having Earthquake is okay. It's actually pretty good, but that's one redeeming factor on this team. Pidgeot is just pathetic, and Executor is just, it's too little too late by this point. Only Alakazam and Rhydon to a degree can stand as sort of competent. Charizard has taken Flamethrower and actually traded it up for Fire Blast. Blastoise does have Hydro Pump, which again, those both are very damaging moves. And at the very least, Venusaur having Sunny Day Solar Beam is not terrible. Arcanine has at least some decent moves. So I guess it's sort of a win at this point, kind of. However, one more interesting thing of note is that Fire Red and Leaf Green was the first game to have Elite Four rematches. As in, their teams change after you fight them again. This is actually after you do everything in the Sevi Islands. Their teams will change. So, we will be going over this. Let's look at their Mark II teams. Though it is also worth noting, as we did with the GSC, its post-game will not weigh as heavily. With Lorelei's Mark II team, we can see it's already a little bit better. She's got more coverage, and her moves are a little bit improved. Piloswine does have a fairly strong stab Earthquake. It's not the most powerful thing in the world, but it is nothing to scoff at. And it does at least have some competent coverage in Rock Slide. Lapras has a solid multi-purpose kit. It's quite good. Bruno Mark II is not terrible, I guess. The upgrade on both Onix and Steelix is actually quite good, and they do have decent stabs, despite their low attacking stats. They do at least have nice bulk, and it is a nice type combination. Hitmonchan's moveset is decent enough, but Hitmonlee is actually where things take a bit of a downgrade. Machamp is decent enough. I'm not really sure why it's given a Persian Berry, though. It doesn't have any self-inflicting confusion moves. Agatha Mark II, at the very least, she gave her team special moves. So it's a little better, but it really doesn't help enough. Gengar with Psychic is not exactly that terrifying, and Crobat and Arbok are just mediocre. And Mischievous is just okay-ish. It's not great. Lance Mark II is actually where things are quite good. It's a bit of a mesh of his original team and his new team from Johto. He does have a decent tech Gyarados that actually also has Earthquake, so it is actually quite good. Not exactly the best, but it's an improvement. 2 Dragonite with fantastic moves by all marks. a Dragon Dancing Kingdra with pretty great special moves, and also Hyper Beam, because why not? Because why not? And an Aerodactyl has, at the very least, physical moves. It's clearly the weakest part of his team, but at least it can sort of fight back. Last, but certainly not least, we have Blue with his Mark, like, what, 9 team is it this time? With how many times we battled him? Normally he's a loser, but this team. Heracross and Tyranitar are monsters. And honestly, they don't have terrible moves. Other than, well, Heracross having Counter instead of Brick Break. I mean, that's really the only negative part you can see here. Even Gyarados has pretty decent moves now that it has Dragon Dance and Earthquake with Hyper Beam. Alakazam is okay, but at least Execute has moves that aren't terrible, at least. Arcanine is where things are a little more questionable, though. However, Overheat is a brutally powerful move, and is something that even today you still see on competitive sets, so it's hardly a bad option for it. Especially when everything else it does have is physical. Blastoise is not terrible. It certainly is an improvement, and Venusaur's moveset is also quite an improvement. Actually, having Sludge Bomb finally does give it a secondary stab, and even though it is physical in this game, at least it can potentially get a poison off. Especially with that Sunny Day Solar Beam, that's quite powerful. Yeah. He's definitely gotten better. It only took a decade of real time. Even excluding post-game, this game only barely makes it even with Ruby and Sapphire. It isn't harder, it isn't easier by a huge portion. It actually pretty much stays the exact same. It's kind of one of the few games where there's really no change in difficulty because, all things considered, the required teams you're going up against are en masse not great. And even though, yes, there are actually some good ones in Ruby and Sapphire, the teams in there as well are bad as well. Like, the thing is, with Ruby and Sapphire, there are teams that are hard, but then at the same time, there are teams that are a complete joke. And it's basically two ends. It's basically one end or the other. Whereas this is, they're not really extremely hard or extremely easy. They're more not terrible, but not spectacular. So it's kind of extremes averaging out into middle of the road, and then something that is just itself consistently in the middle of the road. With the post-game, yes, things do of course get a little spike up, but that's only because there is no post-game of Ruby and Sapphire. It's kind of a playing field where it can't compete. So even excluding post-game, they're pretty competitive with one another in terms of difficulty. They don't really outweigh one another, at least in a large capacity. It's not like, you know, like with Johto, where there was very clearly a winner over the other. You know, that's one of the other things that also does need to be remembered, is that difficulty cannot really be a straight, you know, well, these teams are better than this one. You also have to consider what the Pokemon use as well. A lot of Kanto Pokemon are not especially strong. They don't have especially great stats, and that's one of the other reasons. A lot of Hoenn Pokemon, especially ones players have access to, are actually quite good in terms of stats, relatively speaking. A lot of Kanto Pokemon are pretty abysmal. You know, the creme de la creme of Kanto is a very small group of Pokemon. The rest of them are pretty bad. And that's one of the other reasons why it can't actually stay even, is your resources of Kanto are a lot worse, even though you're punching up against relatively worse teams, because your Pokemon as well are not as great on the whole, compared to Hoenn, where there actually are many better Pokemon in terms of just what is accessible in Hoenn are by and large significantly better. It keeps things competitive. It keeps things quite even, and that's really where things get interesting. Again, it isn't a strict thing of, well, this is just better than this, so this game is better because these teams are better put together. You have to compare with what Pokemon are available. So, that's what the things on Generation 3. Yeah, they pretty much all the same. They're harder, definitely, than Johto, and that, well, actually, we haven't moved on to Emerald yet, so I'm actually doing this. But again, Emerald is a bit of a separate beast altogether, which is why we're kind of comparing these things, because these two games are kind of even together. So, onwards, over to Emerald. Now, with that all done, we return to our regularly scheduled Hoenn program in Emerald. And let's wrap up Gen 3. back to Roxanne, and we will not, this is one thing that's important to remember, is we will not be considering the Trainer Eyes rematches. Yes, I know that they are rematches of important trainer battles, but they're not required in the same way that, say, the Elite Four is. It's not the same thing as the Elite Four. They're optional side things you need to go out of your way to go do, and while, yes, there is something to be said, the same thing for the Elite Four, we're not going over the Gym Leader rematches, we're only going over the Elite Four rematches if they exist. She now has 3 rock types, actually. Yes, Geodude is not especially strong, but they can take hits decently well, and for the point in the game that they are at, it and Nose Pass actually are quite bulky, and they don't have the greatest of offensive stats, but they do have decent moves, and while they don't have the greatest of offensive stats, they're hardly paper thin. Not bad. Fists are flying with Brawly. Now, having added a Metatite to his team, having screens on his team, especially Light Screen, actually is quite good, considering that we mentioned in the previous iteration of Hoenn that the problem he had was actually special attacks. This actually gives him an insurance policy against them. Plus, this thing actually is pretty powerful with the fact that it has huge power, pure power, the same thing. Simply adding special damage reduction completely shores up his entire strategy. Remember, screens are a 50% damage reduction. That is massive. There's a reason competitive teams use that. It is a ludicrous increase. In singles, it is a 50%. In doubles, it's a 33%. It's a little different, depends on the mechanics. But yeah, especially for this early, that is enormous. Plus, it also does add a little bit of special damage on a team that's otherwise very physically based. Watson's amped up his team with a more speed-focused approach to battling this time. However, it does also pack a decent amount of power. And Manectric, for the point in the game, does actually have a quite good special attack and also pretty exceptional speed. Very few things will even come close, if anything actually can. And its special attack is, again, as we've mentioned, very good, so it will hit pretty hard. It's not the bulkiest thing in the world, especially later on, but right now, offensive stats really haven't caught up, so it does have at least a little bit of meat on its bones. Flannery is where you hop out of the frying pan and really jump headlong into the fire. Because everything has overheat. Everyone has sunny day, and Torkoal's got a white herb. It also means it has white smoke. It also has white smoke, meaning you can't drop its stats to consume that white herb early. This means if she can set up sun, she can have nuclear sun-boosted overheats and get those twice over. This is an actual strategy competitive battlers use. So her using it on this team when levels are the way they are, yeah, this is pretty monstrous. That's all putting aside the fact that Torkoal is actually exceedingly bulky for this point, so it can pretty reliably get off 2 of those overheats. And it's Revenge of the Dads, and his team is seemingly a little easier this time. Or is it? He's down 1 slacking, only having 1 this time, so yeah, it's gotta be easier, right? Well, Belly Drum Lanoon does have a little bit to say about that. It's not a Belly Drum Extreme Speed Lanoon, mind you, but it is still a Belly Drum Lanoon. It is quite fast, and if it can maximize its attacking power, this thing will go through stuff pretty easily. And actually, Psybeam Spinda isn't horrible. It's not especially fantastic, but it's not terrible. It hits physical walls in their generally weaker special defense, so not terrible. They're not exactly a perfect compensation, and while he only does have 1 slacking, the 1 slacking he does have is still a slacking. It's brutal. Flying high once again, we have Winona. And she's got a Perish Song Swablu. Yes, Swablu is a pretty all-around terrible Pokemon on its own, but Perish Song is non-discriminatory based on stats. If it can get up that Parasong, you're on a timer, so either KO it or switch out, in which case she has the advantage. So really, it exists for one purpose, but it does that one purpose very well. Again, that's a tactic that is actually used in competitive. Tropius has Chlorophyll. It is also a Tropius with Sunny Day. That's a little terrifying. The reason why this is especially frightening is because Rock is generally a good counter to Flying. And what is Rock weak to? Grass. It also is neutrally damaged by Electric, so can still fight against those pretty well as well. Her Pelipper is the same as before, and also we didn't go over it before, but it's still not terrible. So it's okay enough. For Skarmory, it's still a Skarmory. There's really nothing bad to say about Skarmory. And, oh yes, it's revenge of the illegal Altaria. Once again, it's a monster that if given an inch, it takes a mile and pecks your eyes out. Doubling up back to Tate and Eliza, they have indeed doubled their team's strength. This time, they have packed on an Earthquake Claydol and a Xatu. This actually pairs up extremely well as their entire team is airborne, so they are in no danger of hitting their own allies. And Sunny Day does help to mitigate the Surf weakness, which Surf is actually a required thing to have access to by this point. And as I mentioned before, the singular Pokemon having Sunny Day was a problem. This, because Xatu is extremely quick, does get around that and does circumvent one of those big weaknesses they had prior. So it is a pretty big improvement. It covers the bigger flaws that I did mention in the last one, so maybe they heard my advice, what, nearly two decades in the future? Voice through time. It gives their team a lot more field control, which, again, that's something that is seen in competitive fairly often. It is a pretty solid strategy, and even when used by the AI, it can still work pretty well. Yes, Light Screen only has a 33% damage reduction now, but while they don't have especially great bulk on their team as a whole, they're not paper thin to the point where the reduction of 33 from 50 makes a huge difference. They can still take a hit from it. But this is where all those team improvements go immediately down the drain. Hoenn. Just why? Why Hoenn? You had Hoenn job. Sure, Kingdra is a very solid Pokemon as we've gone over in previous games, but with the badge boosts being a thing at this point, and only having Water Pulse, Chesto Resto's a good idea, but again, only Water Pulse. Yeah, again, it also has a double team to sort of assure that up. Again, a bit of a similar to what we had with Claire's team in the prior games, but at the very least, Claire's had excellent moves to back up its power. All this thing can do is Chesto Resto after double team setup and hope for the best, with a very weak move in Water Pulse. Remember, Kingdra doesn't have the most aggressive offensive stats. It relies on its very balanced stats across the board and good power moves. That's why Claire's was a problem many generations ago, whereas this one is just a pathetic excuse for a Kingdra, because its moves are garbage. Yes, Ice Beam is a solid coverage option, but it doesn't have a strong stab. It doesn't have a primary stab option. Ice Beam and Water Pulse are actually of the exact same strength in a neutral setting. Actually, Ice Beam is actually stronger because back then Ice Beam was 95 power, not 90 as it is now. With stab, Water Pulse is 60 is 90. So, neutrally speaking, it's not its best move to go for Water Pulse. And nothing else on his team has a move above base power 65, with the exception of his Whiscash and his Crawdaunt. And Whiscash does not have good offensive stats whatsoever. It's a bulky Pokemon, and good moves are wasted on it completely. Crawdaunt is slow and quite frail. It's not horrible, but it's also not the most aggressive of threats. Yes, Crabhammer is a pretty decent move, but it only has 90 special attack, which is not especially great. When it's as slow as it is, and also it's not as powerful as it is, it really needs that Crabhammer crit chance. And it can't always rely on those, especially because then it is extremely frail, especially speaking, and also it's not especially quick. And again, it isn't the most powerful thing in terms of its special offense. This is what I mean when I am talking about quality over quantity. Sure, he has 5 Pokemon, but these things are terrible. They're not strong, they're not sturdy, except for, Whiscash, yes, Whiscash is actually quite bulky, but Whiscash really can't put up a fight. One of the reasons why Whiscash is very good normally is Dragon Dance or Stall Setup, and it has neither of these. Having 5 Pokemon is meaningless when all but 2 of them are a complete and total joke, and even one of those is not especially a problem. As we've mentioned, the badge boosts come into play, and they really mitigate anything that these things can have with their pretty substandard offensive power. Again, you had one job, and you failed it. This is why Wallace was better, and even he wasn't much better. Okay, calm down. Calm down. Right. Now, on to your rival. Early game, the rivals team in Rustboro City is actually not bad. In the early fight especially, it is quite indeed a force to begin with, especially with the Torkoal. We've already mentioned how even later in the game, Torkoal is a beast to deal with. Yes, Flannery's did have Overheat and White Herb as well as Slanning Day support potentially, but it still has exceptionally stellar stats, especially for this point in the game. These are pretty monstrous stats. Lombre also is actually pretty decent. It's not the greatest thing in the world, but it is not terrible. Between all of their teams, and all these teams they're not terrible. They can definitely put up a bit of resistance. They're not the greatest thing in the world, but they're far from terrible. But that's why the switch to Slugma at a later battle doesn't make much sense. Torkoal was actually quite good, but Slugma, it's not especially great. Sure, it's got Rock Throw, and Lombre is decent, okay-ish, but they're not especially great, especially by this point. I mean, they can do something, but they're not especially standouts. By the 4th battle, they have fallen off especially hard. Poor moves, poor stats, and there's really not much else to say. Same as before, optional 5th fight, and this is just laughable. Ludicolo only has Absorb as a grass move. Slugma is still a Slugma by this point. Yes, I'm aware it cannot evolve by this point, but my point is that Slugma is just a poor Pokemon in general, especially for a team this late in the game. Especially by this point in the game, its stats are completely terrible, and yes, even though it cannot evolve by this point, that's my point, it can't evolve by this point, so it can't become a half-decently better Slugma evolved from a Cargo. The Grovyle is actually the only thing on any of our teams that actually has a decent set, and that's only by virtue of having a decent move. And that's just pathetic. Again, as we did last time, the first fight with Wally we're just ignoring because the only thing he has there is a Ralt, and we're instead skipping over to his Emerald team. Here's the interesting thing about his Emerald team. We've already been over this exact team before because, as we stated in the prior segment with Ruby and Sapphire, his Emerald team does not change in this final fight. The only difference is after beating the Elite Four and Champion a certain number of times, he will level his team up, but movesets don't change. So all of our comments stay the exact same. The thing is that leveling up is only going to make his team even worse, because everything has pretty poor stats across the board, and the higher levels get, the more they fall behind. Really only Gardevoir and Magneton are things that have half-decent stats, and Magneton, again, is actually quite good because it does have an excellent resistance profile, but it is still quite slow, and even though it has, again, excellent resistances, it and Gardevoir can't pull the team on their own. Yes, a Calm Mind Gardevoir is quite indeed a force, but they're simply just 2 Pokemon, and even then Magneton is not the greatest thing in the world. This game is... it's just swinging around wildly. It's honestly kind of comical. Teams, yes. Magma, Aqua, yes. Both, you, fight. Tabitha first is up on Mount Chimney, and it's not horrible at this point in the game, actually. Yes, Zubat and Poochyena are not especially great, but by this point in the game, nothing is especially strong, I mean, aside from starters. Maxi is where things actually get pretty decent. Camerupt is a serious force at this point in the game, and at least Mightyena has got some pretty big teeth to hurt stuff with. Next, we have the Weather Institute with the Shelly, and is this the exact same team she had before? Let's compare the same team she had before, because I feel like this is the exact same team. Now we're storming the Magma Hideout, where we fight Tabitha. His team is not great, and it's really falling into the weak zone. Only Camerupt could be good, but it just doesn't have any moves of decent power, which is a problem. The same actually continues on into Maxi, but at the very least, Crobat and Camerupt do have stabs, and their stats are actually semi-competent at this point, but they're not especially fantastic. Matt is now waiting for you in the Team Aqua hideout, and yeah, pretty bad team. Like, wow, this actually hurts me more to look at than to fight against. Things pick up a little when you tag battle against Tabitha and Maxi, but it's only a higher level version of the fight you previously had with them, so nothing especially changes. But at the very least, Camerupt does have spread moves which can take advantage of the fact that this is a multi-battle. After this leads to a mostly stabless Shelly, waiting in the seafloor cavern, and again, the only thing I have to say is just why? You're an admin. Everything next is rounded out with Archie's final battle, and oh boy, this is just pitiful. I just don't have much to say about this at the point. Like, how many times can I say the same things over and over and over again? I love you, Archie, but like, no. I don't get how a team named Team Aqua can go through the entire game with no water stabs on their team. Like, I don't get it. Elite Four Sydney is up now that we're at the Elite Four, and most is the same. He's still the weakest link of this Hoenn Elite Four, but at least he's got some neat tech. Like, at least he's got neat tech. Absol can be kind of scary, and a Swords Dancing Crawdon is not the most terrifying thing in the world, but it can do some damage if it eventually gets to the Crawdon. Again, we've already been over, it's pretty frail, but again, if it gets a Sword Dance off, it might be able to do some damage. Phoebe has upped her game, adding some more power, some wide coverage, and solid bulk. Sableye is, again, having a pretty janky tech with some residual damage. I like it. I like it a lot. It's time to cool it with Galacia, who has barely changed. The only thing that actually have changed is that she actually dropped Hail. The only difference is that she's actually dropped Hail for the speed decreasing Icy Wind, and now one of her Glalie is actually packing Explosion. Also, her Celio have lost their weather-setting moves, so I'd say a bit of a downgrade overall. Drake, however, he's always coming through. His team is much better. Shelgon is now a bit more offensive, packing Double Edge, which is blocked by the recoil negating Rock Head ability, so it can actually deal out not a ridiculous amount of damage, but it can actually deal out quite respectable damage considering it is meant a bit of it as a wall. It still has its slowdown tech with Rock Tomb, and Altaria is definitely packing more power with Double Edge, though unlike Shelgon, it is taking recoil damage, which does eat into a little bit of its bulk, which is its one redeeming factor. It also still has Dragon Dance as its standby move of buffing potential. Again, quite powerful indeed. Flygon finally is packing Earthquake, and the other has been changed to a very solid Kingdra. See, Hoenn, this is how you do it right. And, as always, his Salamance is the beast that brings in the end of the team. Fly has been exchanged for Rock Slide, so it's now warding Ice types a little better from both ends, physical and special. His team improvements definitely makes up for what the other Elite Four lack in improvements. But let's see about the champion, and if you thought that Drake could compensate for everything, Wallace is here to give you a bit of a bad day on that. Yeah, you thought a good champion was coming? Sure, these Pokemon he has aren't bad, but with the badge boosts in effect, they're all just kind of mediocre. There's maybe 2 or 3 of them that are actually quite standout, but not really enough to pull together. Compare that to, like, other champion teams where they're actually much better quality overall. This is just laughable. Milotic is quite good. I mean, it is a Milotic, and it does have actually fantastic. Even with the badge boosts, it's still not terribly outstatted. His Gyarados is sort of good. It's not, it's okay-ish. And Ludicolo is not worthless, but the others, no. His team is indeed bulky in a large capacity, but the problem is that the quality of them are terrible. One of the reasons why Stevens worked was that it had a good combination of bulky offense. It could do a lot of damage while taking minimal damage itself. This team doesn't have that. Only really Ludicolo, because it has a very awkward type combination and Leech Seed in conjunction with that, and Milotic's natural stat bulk, can really pull this off as opposed to pretty much a full team composition. The problem really comes into that he's not bulky enough to bulk, and he's not offensive enough to offense. He kind of goes in the middle ground where it doesn't really work. Sure, 150 base power water spouts from Wailord can be quite threatening, only if it's at full health. Remember, water spout's effect is the higher your HP, the more damage it does. However, Walrein is quite slow, and this means it is likely not going to be getting off the full power of its water spouts. Even with Milotic having a pretty decent Toxic Stall set and Hydro Pump, it just can't carry all the weight of this failure by itself. It's unfortunate, but it just can't. Overall, he's about as sturdy as a melting ice cube, fitting of his water type. There may be no Elite Four rematches, but there is indeed one super boss waiting for you at the end of the game. The true champion of the Hoenn region. Steven Stone is back with a vengeance. His team is largely identical to his original team, and what is different is actually very much improved. The changes here are Dilli receiving Ingrain, paired up with his excellent bulk across the board. This is a monstrous power set for it. It allows it to really have some great sustain. Metagross now having Shadow Ball it's a decently threatening option. It's not the greatest thing in the world, but it is quite good in place of its other move. Yes, his Aggron and Armaldo are very much his weak links, but on a team of living walls, the weakest link of a living wall team, there's going to naturally be one there, and really even both of these are not horrible. Aggron, yes, is not the greatest thing in the world, but they're far from terrible. Even with the badge boosts in effect, they can still put up a fight. I mean, unless you're hitting them in their lowest defensive stat with a stab super effective move, the badge boosts somewhat, I wouldn't say don't matter for them, but they can still handle them quite well. And with all of that, yeah, Emerald is a lot harder than Fire Red and Leaf Green. Yes, rivals and villains, they're always quite bad, and this is no different in here. But where things really stepped up was the gyms and was the Elite Four, as was the case of the original Ruby and Sapphire. So this just continues the trend by taking what was already a good step up and furthering that step up in a greater capacity. Yes, Wallace is a massive downgrade from Steven, but the changes made to the gyms are much more consistent in higher difficulty than a singular champion being weaker. As we said before, consistency would matter much more, and this game does have that consistency. With post-game in consideration, and consideration of Fire Red Leaf Green's post-game, this is actually where things will get a little bit more interesting, because yes, there was only one battle in Emerald, and Steven is indeed a monstrous thing to be dealing with, I wouldn't say on his own he's been able to contend, because, yes, the Fire Leaf Green post-game rematches are not the most stellar of things. They actually are they're not quite great across the board, but they're not horrible. Steven sometimes has the best elements of a lot of those things in that he's actually, in all ways, a difficult fight. He has great Pokemon across the board with only some things that are not spectacular, but still, even at... I'm not really saying that, I'm not really having the right words here, but essentially, Steven at his worst is still quite good. That's pretty much what I'm trying to say. Even at his worst, he's still a quite good opponent, and his team is quite challenging regardless. So, really for everything of the improvements to the gyms, the Elite Four, where there are those, the downgrades in those same areas are kind of counterbalanced. Yes, the rivals are terrible. Yes, the villains, I would say, in this game are worse than the ones in Fire Red and Leaf Green, but on the whole, there are much more battles taking place with Elite Four and gym leaders than there are with just the villains and the rivals. So, yeah, Emerald, we are continuing the trend of the games getting more difficult as they go. Ruby Sapphire was a step up from Gen 2. The only side grade one was really Fire Red Leaf Green, where that's really just comparable to Ruby Sapphire, and that's just because the quality of Pokemon in Kanto are not spectacular. But then we have Emerald taking a definitive step upwards. I look forward to seeing you guys again when we go to Sinnoh. Things are gonna get a lot more interesting there. You guys then.